to our last session of presentations at this symposium, an international symposium in hermeneutic philosophy. Over the last few days, we've been discussing many things, and I think there are some thoughts that need to be, for which me, Dr. Ramsey, and I were hoping that we can discuss them also in a broader context of what will be presented now, also in a broader context of what has been discussed over these past days. So we have made the idea for this afternoon is, since there are quite a lot of presenters, unfortunately one of them could not be, Dr. Lisa Fellers-Watrous could not be with us due to a death in the family. But since there are quite many and we have 2 hours at our disposals, we have sort of come to the conclusion that it would be best if we try to keep our papers somewhat shorter, in the sense of that they are not very they do not necessarily have to be very elaborate in what they're trying to say, but on the other hand they should, I mean, they want to be, of course they want to be pointed to the point, so in the sense that they would provoke discussion. Yet we would like to keep this part of discussion part for the concluding discussion that will take place later on, so that now we should go through the papers, let them be presented, and then we could discuss not only what, or individually with today's presenters, what they are going to say, what they will have said, but also the entirety of the symposium and the question that we've been discussing for 3 days, the question that relates beauty, utopia, and imagination, and that attempts to sort of think of it, of its possibility or impossibility in the here and the now of today's world. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Neža Zajc, who is a researcher at the Inštitut that is affiliated to the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts here in Ljubljana, but who is also a poet. She will also, the title of her presentation has been somewhat modified, so just minutely modified, and it reads: Beauty between art and creation, between poetry and poetics, the historical survey on the universal humanistic view. Please, thank you.
Thank you for this. Thank you for your kind presentation. Introduction. One of the most prominent and important poets in Slovene modern poetry, Dane Zajc, once said that exist 2 types of poems. The first type visits the poet without pre-announcement, without explicit and obvious inspiration movement, and it appears very clearly, perhaps in even visually or touchable manner, as it was in her pre-existent final form. It simply arrives as if by dictation. It remains in the poet's soul as the miracle gift, a mercy from the outside, from the highest. The second type of the poems demands more tasks and skills from the poet, the most commonly related to editing the text. But let me begin from the beginnings. Already in one of the first attempts at explication of human creative expression by Aristotle in Poetics, one had to face 2 opposite ways of making mimesis and poesis, confronting through expression itself 2 different manners of reception, or perhaps 2 different forms of human perception. While mimetic vision is enclosed within a pre-visional conceptual way of perception and planning of one's mental activity, the poesis principle enables the human being the process of thinking and realizing his own creational vision. The basic difference, in our opinion, is in managing the two horizons, perspective of the last and the closure in one's often fixed idea in the first. That means that poesis fundamentally allows the intervention of the other, conditionally set a dialogue with the other. Speaking in the terms of inspiration, in that concept, in many cases, could be traced the inspiration from the highest. Yet, Aristotle also connected the verbal expression with the perception of symmetry, which was somehow always associated with beauty. Plato, when he spoke about beauty, encircled her majesty in many of her explicit properties, that is, within the obvious outside surface, having in mind visible beauty in the here and now, which can uplift the soul and lead it back to the recollection of beauty itself. It can also attract the beholder without leading him towards the beauty of the soul or even to beauty itself. The threat needed thus to be addressed through an anamnesis. This may also be seen in Dante in the Divine Comedy, insofar as his voyage to paradise requires leaving behind the merely mortal world. In our short talk, we will focus clearly on beauty as she resides internally, that is, within and essentially, or through the spiritual dimension. What is interesting enough is that already Plato expressed that all goodness came from the light above, and within doubled the Apostle Jacob in his first letter in the New Testament with words, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation and shifting shadow." The medium or mediator of the light afterwards remains in the human's thought about the beauty from the antiquity to Middle Ages. The triad between aesthetical, philosophical, and ethical values achieved another perception with Plotinus in his treatise on beauty, where he suggested the term true beauty. In the sixth Aeneid he wrote, "We have to recognize that beauty is that which irradiates symmetry rather than symmetry itself, and it is that which truly calls out love." And he continues, "Why are the most living portraits the most beautiful?" It was in late 3rd century that these thoughts of Plotinus, written in the age of Roman Emperor Gallienus, found a place in the new development of aesthetic theory, which defines in Plotinus' words the beauty that enthrones itself, giving itself to the parts as to the sum. This is how the material thing becomes beautiful, by communicating in the thought that flows from the divine. This aesthetic formula of Plotinus rendered not only Roman, but even more so all periods of Byzantine art intelligible. Byzantine theologians and church fathers soon began to speak about the beauty in and through the Christian dimension, particularly about the beauty in liturgy and the church as the sacred space of worship. But in the terms of individual human being, they understood the beauty as it is reserved for the Holy Mother of God, Theotokos, and God the Son, accepted exactly as the incarnated Logos. This is the reason why in Byzantine literature, whereas in the Pleiades of the multiple existence of human creative activities, poetry was never excluded from the sacred arts, and through the juxtaposition of the literary and artistic imagination were interchangeable and in the inspired discourse. An example of such inspired Christian Byzantine poetry may be found in the poems of Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, particularly of his second Carmina, which expresses his belief that although beauty for Christians lies in theoria, spiritual contemplation, still he does not accept that the pagans should be better skilled in logos. This kind of stressing the ability of thinking and expressing indeed about theological issues is a heritage of an older classical philosophical tradition, but this time through Gregory of Nazianzus, it is radically transformed into a type of metamorphosis of theocentric horizons. The human being, with his ability to perceive and to meditate, has been placed paradoxically into the very center of God's creativity and into the kernel of created world. If we consider also Gregory's specific cosmological view, we could soon perceive also the view of geodesia as an important implement in optics used in the basic Byzantine perspective of creation of Constantinople mosaics. The monastically based thesis concerning Orthodox iconography, which embodies the inspired word from the highest, was designed for those who were humble enough to receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, such that they might manage to visibly perceive what arms should write, such is the term ikonopisanie, literally the writing of icons. It is the moment where the mimetic and poetic principles are combined in the view of replica, which is in fact the act of highly inspired creation of new but canonical artifact. The analog reaction we could notice in the commentaries of the Divine Liturgy, in which the synergetic process of the encoding the Holy Scriptures produces a combined mimetically poetic space for hymnographic records. St. Maximus the Confessor made a next step from Gregory Nazianzus' theoria to theoria liturgia and mystagogical contemplation. The symbolic meaning which provided the application of the theoria into the universe coincided with the human mind and his contemplative praxis, and also the action of the Holy Spirit. It could be noticed that the dialogues between the soul and the mind in the Byzantine Christian poetical writings never ended. It was intentionally and intensely open-ended. However, the living and the mortal principles in Byzantine iconography combined in this manner has never been completely understood in the West, but the reflection of such perception, particularly about beauty, could be seen in Dante's vision of the immortality of the human, particularly of the soul. Although it was soon recognized as the difference between the visible and deeper beauty, in the Christian West, much more attention was paid to the formation of beauty as the visible, as the image, rather than as the internal principle. However, Dante's poetry is the most well-known example of the active combination of vision and thought in the verse form. The new conception of creativity is unambiguously suddenly tied to a world of affective love and philosophy. The modern aesthetic sensibility was yet still not entirely permitted, while the mystic thought provided the new poetry with a way of explaining, tracing, and filling the entirety of human intelligibility with its intuitive character. In the Thomistic Aristotelian view, such beauty properly involved the notion of form. The medieval vision of divine light was accompanied with a this-worldly aesthetic of proportion. Through the juxtaposition, the word and the image were dangerously secularist, but the image suddenly prevailed the word. This proceeded in the solitude, which became a personal escape. Consequently, happened a noticeable ending of the humanistic awareness of the timeless eternity at the end of Renaissance period. But even previously, it was happened next. In Italy, the first theoretical attempt of defining the human act of visual creation was written by Cennino Cennini in his Libro dell'arte, in which he also did not separate artistic and sacred terms. On the contrary, he regarded as the key for his literary definition the use of the words from the Holy Scripture and the Church realities. Living ideas had replaced the apparently remote Platonic archetypes, yet nevertheless the artistic was already quite conscious of his own contribution to the emerging formation toward new direction in aesthetic akin to the human-centered world. In the Renaissance, Michelangelo Buonarroti was also preoccupied with the mistress of death and the secret of the visual beauty of the mortal human. Through poetry, Michelangelo solved his contradictory doubts about artistic talent and progress of constant formation in highly sophisticated but distinctively spiritually inclined verse, sometimes sober, and most of always melancholic. This was not the occasional feeling, but rather the highly inspiring movement of the energy of artist's soul alone. In his intimate poesis of word formation, building in stone material, he finally overcame the physical attraction of young Tommaso Cavalieri, and the personification of amor began to metamorphose into his fully spiritual love toward Vittoria Colonna. Michelangelo, who 3 times depicted the Pietà motif, expressed after the death of Vittoria Colonna in the first poem that although his rude hammer into stubborn stone gives human shape, only at will, fall in his hand who wields and guides is that which dwells in heaven, and the world doth fill with beauty by pure motions of its own. Its life makes all that lives with living skill. The artist, poet, thus concluded that if nevertheless unfinished, but if inspired by God himself, the monument must gain the level of timely persistence, of course, in the face of death. Wherefore, unfinished, I must meet my end. If God, the great artificer, denies that aid which was unique on earth before. Regarding the relation between the art and poetry, valuing the artist as higher than the poet, was also embraced by Leonardo da Vinci in his Trattatello della Pittura. By this theoretical work was he made a step alongside Cennino Cennini, because he did not much contribute to the problem of personal ability to preserve the historical human heritage, but thus he indeed created the multifunctional and restless man of the universe. But let me present in detail one last example from the period of the High Renaissance, which could serve to illustrate the above-mentioned reception of beauty as unmediated spiritual vision expressed by the words of personal affection, mystically opened through and paradoxically poetical not only self, but our self-consciousness. Saint Maximus the Greek, a learned Greek who spent his early years searching for the knowledge and sacred wisdom in northern Renaissance Italy as scribe and as a tutor, then became an Athonite monk. Invited to Russia as a translator and redactor of sacred books, he was, after 7 years, accused of heretical errors by the Russian church authorities. He then spent nearly 27 years in monastery prison, including solitary confinement. Yet he was eventually permitted to write during his extended imprisonment. In one text he wrote about the meaning of the ecological term of Pietà. When he observed that the Russians understood the iconographic motif of pietà as their melancholy or diminishing, he proposed a more appropriate understanding, claiming that this expression was not designed by human thought. By providing a story which he heard from the pious people in Italy, he then narrated the mystical action of the procession of the divine liturgy. He wrote that once Pope Gregory the Great conducted the liturgy, that during the act of dealing with the sacred bloodless gifts, suddenly Christ himself appeared in front of him. From the Pope's eyes began to spread tears of spiritual compassion. From that moment forward, he ordered the icon writers to depict exactly such Christ image, not made with human hands. Through this short text by Maximus the Greek concerning the liturgical act of celebrating chanting hymns and dedicating the holy gifts under the spiritual guidance of the Holy Spirit, through the human's complete humbleness, the visual image of God the Son achieved not only the level of personal vision, but the truly poetically characterized endeavor on beauty itself, which remained in the cultural memory as conspiratorial order or duty, and should then be exclusively and non-mimetically followed by all future pious artists. According to the beginning of this speech, first type of the poem, designed by Dane Zeitz, as I said, the first type of the poem, which is by itself, in fact, poetical visit of the muse, requires from the artist or the poet afterwards more attempts to mimetically reproduce as much as possible the same form as it happened in his previous spiritual experience. On the other hand, the second type includes the poetical view of the poet, which is in the process of the creation mimetically enlightened. But both forms call for the research and understanding of this complex, secret, or mystery of poetically mimetically inspired act in the field of hermeneutics. Thank you for your attention. Here you have a preservation, a page from the manuscript of St. Maximus the Greek about him who I spoke in the last part of my speech. And this is supposed to be his autoportrait, and this is his manuscripts, which I am researching in the original form. This is the manuscript which is now in the National Library of Paris, but most of his manuscripts are unfortunately in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zeitz, for this very rich presentation. If not anything else, reminding us that look into the history and into the historical development of some of the ideas that we are discussing here opens up the depth of the questioning about beauty, wherein we are all about which we are trying to have a conversation, about which sometimes we also lose our words. So I guess next time, and if Dr. Zeitz began with the modern poetry of the Slovenian poet Dane Zeitz, and ended with the high Renaissance. So at the beginning of modernity. Now we sort of return back to the end of the modernity with my paper. I will discuss a poem by Paul Celan. So, although I guess you might be already tired of looking at my face, bear with me for just a little. It is just, I'm just so grateful and humbled by the possibility of seeing you, for the possibility and by the possibility of seeing you all here gathered together in a mutually respectful, we could also say solidary conversation. So the title of my paper reads, it's a quotation to which I return in the end, and set yourself free. Paul Celan's Poetics of Utopia. In the speech pronounced on the occasion of the award of the Georg Büchner Prize in the Meridian, the famous speech Meridian, der Meridian, Paul Celan asks of himself, I quote, "Topos research, by all means, but in light of what's to be explored, in light of utopia, and human beings and creature in this light," end quote. What follows is by no means an attempt to discuss in detail the question of utopia as it relates to the poetry and the poetology of the German-speaking author of Jewish descent, Paul Celan, one of the greatest poets, if not even the poet of the 20th century, of its abysmal contradictions and conflicts. I do not seek to deliberate neither, on the one hand, upon a presupposed comprehensive poetics from which the saying and the silence of Celan's enigmatic language might stem, nor, on the other hand, upon the potential influences that might have inspired the poet to speak about utopia. So Celan was an avid reader of philosophy, and among many of the books that he read, and to which we have also what he annotated in them is also the works of Ernst Bloch. I would, however, like to pause at the hyphen indicated in the subtitle of my paper, so Utopia. The hyphen is not my addition, but Celan's own diction from the quotation that I just read. So that I would like to pause at this hyphen, that smallest of graphic signs, the little line that creeps itself into the tissue of the text as a mark, a demarcation of a gap, a tear, a cut, which, perhaps, who knows, whilst at one at the same time, at the same and one place, holds together and holds apart, unbinds, written with a hyphen, opens up the uncertainty of the in-between, of proximity and distance between what it beholds, what beholds it. What follows then is or wishes to be a sort of a contemplation upon the pause of a hyphen, a pausing at a pause. What could the hyphen within and of utopia mean, denote, or even notate? I shall endeavor to address the issue by and through a reading, which is by far an interpretation, of the short poem Stehen, the one that I have just handed out to you. A poem that in the central stanza not only features a series of hyphens, a densely hyphenated expression, but is also, at least for my reading, transmuted or even mutated with hyphens, with them. They are embodied in the unnotable form of the poignant breaks of the poetic thought, the poetic uttering being transported by what, by whom, over the soundlessly gaping abyss of the forever disclosed, that is to say, closed and disclosed, open and closed, ending of the verse line. I will make myself a bit clearer, at least. So the poem Stehen was written in the author's Paris exile on November 11, 1963. The poem sings, I will first read it in the German original, as I believe that all poetry should first and foremost also be heard. And then I have given you two translations which are the differences between which are, one could almost say minute, but I will not discuss the differences of the poem, and I will of the translations, of the English translations, I'll just read then John Felstiner's translation, the second one that you have on the paper. Stehen, im Schatten des Wundenmals in der Luft, für niemand und nichts stehen, unerkannt, für dich allein, mit allem, was darin Raum hat, auch ohne Sprache. And John Felstiner's translation. To stand in the shadow of a scar in the air. Stand for no one and nothing, unrecognized, for you alone, with all that has room within it, even without language. The scant and sparse, almost destitute language of the poem implores, within the three short stanzas, the nearly enumerating staccato of the paratactical succession of four, essentially verbless, yet at the same time nominalizing sentences. So this staccato unfolds itself with a suspended singing, interspersed with the shrillness of silence, which is characteristic of Celan's late poetry. So this language implores a or the standing, a sort of self-instantiation of which, at least at the beginning, nothing is said what, if anything at all, it signifies, whom, if anyone at all, it means. Some sort of jutting out, protrusion, formless, bare, perhaps even pure. So this protrusion between the earthly and the heavenly that both elude perception while surrendering the world to the middle, while surrendering the middle to the world. The measuring out of the worldly dimensionality thus circumscribed is overshadowed by, again, we don't know if it is the or a sign of, the German original says the sign of the scar. This sort of, this sign of the scar, of a scar, freely floating in the air. However, one cannot deduce if it is not precisely the shadow that gives and prescribes the measure to this standing. Why? What does it stand for? Both English versions are somewhat more exact when they render stehen as to stand, because in the German original it can be read at the same time as a verbal and nominal expression. So stehen as something that's going on, or stehen as something that's sort of stationary. Without further more positively elucidating the puzzling words of the opening stanza, the poem, in an assertoric or even axiomatic manner of an almost formulaic but accentuated and articulated statement, postulates a negativity. I use a lot of quotation marks because it's difficult to sort of come closer to the poem. So this negativity, which resigns itself sinking into secrecy of indetermination or indefinition, standing, regardless of whom or what it designates, regardless of the circumstance that it may be allocates a place and allots the perseverance of constancy to the world, to its worldliness, occurs, is happening, as the poem says, for no one and nothing. Although it therefore must remain also unrecognized for this no one or for this nothing, it itself, whatever it may be, before the face or the facelessness of the imposing exposition of the downwardly and upwardly directed self-protraction against, that is to say, in front of, in a confrontation with, the groundlessness and the shelterlessness of the world, turns alone towards the absolutely, perhaps even the wholly other, or the other with the word. On the boundless baselessness of such a self-resistance, such self-stance, such a such a self-being of standing, of the bespoken selfhood addressing itself to the other. Wait. Sorry. I lost my place. A return to the selfness, self-givenness, a disposal for the non-disposable alterity of the addressed selfhood bespeaking the other, the doubly unique verse break, the enjambement between the verses für dich allein. Okay, this verse break. I guess I missed a verb somewhere here. The verse break is practically the only change that happened in the genesis of the poem. So does this self-instantiation, the standing, this sort of the stance of the self, not come through an encounter which releases the unavoidable, unbridgeable cleft between one and the other, between the strangely own and the properly alien self, through, let's say, communal and communicable sociability or sociality, through the mutuality of the interhuman to itself. So it returns to itself through the other, but whilst it returns to itself as a kind of an I. So, it's more, or in essence, more of a me. So with the reserve, this restrained movement of the poem, with the movement that reserves the poem, with a singular reconvening of the own and the alien taking place each time anew in the shadow of a scar in the air, with the event of their contrasting and contracting, their chiastically diastatic permission or interlinking, the in-between, the roominess of space is set free for the impossibility, again with a hyphen, the possibility within the impossible, the impossibility within the possible, of that to which the concluding two verse lines, by a meaningfully repeated break, paradoxically lend their secretively silenced voice, even without language. So this opens up the impossibility of bearing witness of a poetic testimony of which it is not known if it is on this side or beyond language, of sort of speaking of a poetic utterance, again, of which it is not known if it is beyond or on this side of witnessing, a sort of a testament of a writing of poetry. But can or could one connect the poem Stehen, thus, as I feel myself compelled to readily admit, questionably, that is to say, interrogatively illuminated, at all with the context of Celan's Poetics of Utopia indicated in the subtitle? And if so, if this can be done, how? Poetry, as Celan comprehends it, as he attempts to circumscribe it in his autopoetological writings, such as the Meridian, is a language of crossing of borders, of a movement between them, of transpositions and of transversions, of traversal that is born and comes to the world, even becomes it, as life itself characterized, that is to say, outlined with the shadow of death, as the always plurally, by and through itself differentiated and deferred event of singularity, as a barely perceptible, well-nigh imperceptible breath of air. It is a language, the voice of which, through and by its naming, also of the unnamed, also of the unnameable, discloses the mortal human being as a person, as an I. It is a language that, always on its way, returning to the other, but always on their way, returning to the other, but nevertheless enduringly mindful of the dates, the endured experiences, within the turn of breath, within the breath turn, withstands or stands within the frightful muting. A language which offers itself from one hand to the other hand, from the hand of the poet to the hand of the reader, in order only, albeit broken, albeit transformed, maybe to return to itself, to come home, to be able to humanly and humanely testify to and for humanity. So a language always on the way, a writing, the remaining, this appearing trace of what Celan calls the secret of the encounter. Poetry of Paul Celan, through each of its changes, maintains the memory, the remembrance of, as he puts it, that which happened. That which allows and denies itself to be named by the infamous or famous word Auschwitz. The path toward a corresponding comprehension of Celan's poetics of Utopia leads through the fathomless certitude of the Holocaust, through the experience of the Shoah, or as he used the word Hurban. It leads through ashes. The sign of the scar in the air, in the shadow of which standing, and also stehen, establishes itself, one could even say erects itself, by perhaps rendering resistance, that is to say, it stands to the shadow, contrary to potentially reading it as a sort of transfiguration of the wounds of Christ, namely the Wundmal that Celan uses in the poem is very near the Wundmale Christi, so the wounds, the signs of wounds of Christ in the German language. So it is not a transfiguration of the wood. That would be sort of like a Christian, perhaps could be a Christian reading of Celan's poetry. So this sign can maybe be considered as the openness, the chasm of the permanently sore, constantly bleeding injury, of a traumatic wounding that can never be healed and made whole again. If Gustav Landauer, in his treatise Revolution from 1907, I refer to him because Celan in the Meridian namely characterizes himself as someone who grew up with the writings of Landauer and Peter Kropotkin, and he had this book and we know that he read it, even probably during the time when he was when he was still in Romania or in Bukovina. If Landauer depicts the turbulent flow or the flowing of history as a continual alteration within the cyclical two-part rhythm, which is a sort of reciprocally unrhymable arrhythmia between topia and utopia. And for him, topia represents periods of a stable balance in human coexistence, and utopia periods of heterogeneous tendencies of individual endeavors. For him, each utopia as a sort of dissolution, that is to say, a decline, but at the same time as a resolution of utopia is followed by a utopia, and each utopia, the same thing, as a decline or a dissolution, a resolution, is followed by a topia. For him, thus, both of them inextricably bound to and by each other. However, they are sort of constantly interchanging, but nonetheless necessarily belong together, are part of one and the same historical movement. On the other hand, when listening to what Celan names utopia, we may be obliged to, taking into account this hyphenated writing of Utopia and the passage from Celan's The Meridian, taking into account this concurrence, the coincidence of the topic and the utopian, raise the question. However, it remains a question because Celan uses the word in his speech utopia, the words 3 times, and only once in this passage that I quoted he writes it with a hyphen. So this question then sort of, and with which I'm coming to the end of my paper, does this insignificantly indistinguishable hyphen make manifest? Is it itself not the grapheme of this injury, the writing of the sign of a wound? The mark of a wounding as the place of passage where through light can perhaps transpierce the shadow, where through the shadow can perhaps transpierce the light. So, to put it like even more compressed, in an even more compressed manner, the writing of an sort of over-enshadowed light, or the writing of an over-enlightened shadow, this writing of a breath turn, the turn of breath, perhaps even, and this would be the next step to which Celan also during the end, towards the end of his life in one questionnaire. So it would be a writing of a sort of revolution. However, standing at the end, yet again as always with nothing but questions, standing with the poem stehen. Standing at the end, again at the beginning, I wonder whether poetry, if it is supposed to be, if it actually can be a breath turn, as I said, a sort of a revolution, gives us to ponder that one may not require, in order to withstand within the world, in order to dwell within its wounds, a different response, a different responsibility. So despite the death, despite and in face of all this, the responsibility, the response of life. In the Meridian, in the speech pronounced on the occasion of the award of the Georg Büchner Prize, Paul Celan asks of us, I quote, "Enlarge art? No, but with art go into your very self-most straits and set yourself free." Thank you. So, thank you once more for your kind attention. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Alenka Koželj, who is a freelance writer and translator, and turning again the historical perspective towards the look into the history, her paper on Hildegard of Bingen.
First, I would like to thank everyone who's here and who's participating in this wonderful atmosphere, in this wonderful ambience that has been developed around this event. Being a writer by profession and by heart, I use this opportunity to present a paper that resembles a literary creation, a humble short story even. It is how I imagine one of the greatest medieval mystics and nuns, Hildegard of Bingen, would talk to herself during one of her mystic states that represented both a blessing and an unspeakable torture for her. This is an homage to a great, strong-willed, independent woman who throughout her life underwent terrible ordeals, but still managed to convey to the rest of the world a message of love and caritas, charity. I am lying in my modest bed. It's hard, it's deprived of all comfort, but it's suitable for my state, for my place in a strangely simplified and, on the other hand, unbelievably complicated hierarchy of the society in which I live. And yet I don't feel deprived. On the contrary, I feel as if I were lying on a cloud looking down on the world below me. I understand its workings. I can live in a system. They say that I am wise and cunning, sometimes even shrewd. Well, I believe they are not entirely wrong. This is the second monastery under my leadership. I have watched it grow out of nothing, out of mud, out of puddles in which I lived with my beloved daughters for so many years. This now is mine. Some people judge me by saying that I am guilty of the sin of pride. They just might be right. I am proud of certain accomplishments I have achieved. I deem myself to be a loving, strict yet not rigid mother to my nuns. I am a confidant to some of the most famous men of my era. Popes, kings, and common people likewise flock around me in search for answers to their various queries. It is my visions they rely on. They crave them. I see everything, and what I see sometimes hurts. Prey to a morbid tingle in my legs, I haven't been standing on my own 2 feet for about a week now. My limbs are made of lead. I cannot move, cannot talk. I live in my pain like an unborn baby dwells in his mother's womb. This is the light of the mind Sylvia Plath will write almost 1,000 years after my birth. When I try to open my eyes, it feels as if some strange power would pull them back down. Underneath, a strange cosmic ballet takes place. Flashes of light transpierce the darkness as a shooting star running towards its glorious annihilation. The swirls of most enchanting colors are stuck in my brain like whirling flowers. This is when my visions visit me. I quote, "Father, I am greatly disturbed by a vision which has appeared to me through divine revelation, a vision seen not with my fleshly eyes, but only in my spirit. Wretched, and indeed more than wretched in my womanly condition, I have from the earliest childhood seen great marvels which my tongue has no power to express, but which the Spirit of God has taught me that I may believe. Through this vision which touches my heart and soul like a burning flame, teaching me profundities of meaning, I have an inward understanding of the Psalter, the Gospels, and other volumes." End quote. I live in a period that is about to get known to the future generations as the Renaissance of the 12th century. It is not as widely known as the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th century, or not even as the Carolingian Renaissance, but it has contributed some of the greatest accomplishments of the spiritual and material history of man. It is a time of bowing to the beauty in all the fields of human endeavor. I never thought that my life, my way of thinking, my feelings even, will one day be reduced to a concept, to a name, repeated by scholars and academics and admirers of the Middle Ages all over the world. I didn't know that the way in which I embrace the world will have a name. I simply know that this world is a beautiful place. How couldn't it be beautiful since it was created by such a benevolent creator, given to the man to enjoy and indulge in? Since the world was created by God, and since God can only be perceived as in every way perfect, we can deduce that God is also the purest form of love, one that can only be comprehended by the feeble human man through symbols. The symbols can be indeed found everywhere, especially in nature, and that is one of the reasons I enjoy writing and dispersing my knowledge about gems, natural history, meteorological occurrences, etc. To me, these are all precious, palpable signs of godly love and favor. My view of natural phenomena is intrinsically holistic. I believe that every natural event is somehow linked to other events or phenomena. For instance, this is what I think of eclipses. I quote, "Sometimes an eclipse of the moon is seen when the elements and the storms collide as though they had a conflict among them. On these occasions, the moon is darkened by the storms for a period rather than waning or being extinguished. But the force of the moon is such that it can overcome these storms and send out its splendor again, because the force of the moon is greater than the force of these storms." End quote. The universe, in my view, is a complicated system of correspondences, a plethora of phenomena where one element refers to another, and where spiritual, or should I say the moral, always walks hand in hand with the material. This is a wonderful, enchanting world, a sort of utopia, where every element refers to every other element, where objects refer us to ideas. It is a world of ongoing revelation where God can be seen in the tiniest parts of a magnificent creation. The scholars of tomorrow will come up with a name for this way of looking at the world. It's medieval symbolism. Johann Huizinga will write his notable work, The Autumn in the Middle Ages, and masterfully scrutinize the manner in which the medieval symbolism evolved in a few centuries, where the more open, multi-layered symbols from the High Middle Ages eventually turned into stiff, rigid allegories where every element of creation through an intellectually challenging procedure attained a complicated allegorical meaning. It is an intricate system of correspondences that above all tends to explain the world and the role that a man plays in it. But the world that Heisinga describes with such delectable sovereignty is still far away. The world of symbols in which I dwell and create is still far away from the mental condition of the man of 15th century. On the contrary, reading the symbols for me means freedom, expansion of the mind, indeed, the light of the mind. Me and my contemporaries deem the man to be a beautiful microcosm, a reflection of the mysterious macrocosm of the world created by an omnipotent, omnipresent creator who considers the man to be his most accomplished creation and yearns to entertain a relationship with him. I quote, "Human creature, take a careful look at humankind. Each human being contains heaven and earth and all creation, and yet remains one whole figure, and within every being all things lie concealed. In my world, so far from the world inhabited by the people of the 21st century, even natural disasters bear a symbolic meaning." I quote, "Frequently these storms occur according to God's judgment because of wickedness or because of evil deeds perpetrated by men, or as portents of future dangers such as war, famine, or sudden death. The reason is that all our actions affect the elements and are in turn disturbed and influenced by the elements. I am lying in my bed. I feel as though nails would pierce my hands and feet. And yet my wretched state is not without beauty. As I wrote, I quote, "When I had spoken these words, I ran down the narrow path and hid myself in a small cave towards the north, weeping bitterly since I have lost my mother. Here too I considered all my pain and all my wounds. Here I cried and wept, pouring out my tears so that all the pain and malice of my wounds were flooded with tears. Suddenly a pleasant fragrance touched my nostrils, like a gentle breeze sent to me from my mother. What sighs I uttered and what tears I shed when I felt that modicum of comfort. I cried and wept such tears of joy that even the mountain was moved in whose cave was I hidden." End quote. I was born a 10th child in a rich family of nobility, and as such I was destined to a life in a monastery. At 8 I was sent away to live with a recluse and mystic in her own right, Jutta of Spanheim. It was a strange and in a way exquisite life that we led, 2 women crowded in a small chamber, where the only contact with the other world was the hand that once a day speechlessly handed us our meager meal. It was there where it all started. The voices, the light, the bodily suffering, the physical and spiritual anguish that I continue to experience now, lying in pain on my bed in the infirmary, tended to by my faithful beloved sisters. I am not yet aware of the fact that in the future, various scholars will come up with various ideas about what could be a physical cause of my mystical visions. Was it a vicious migraine, bouts of schizophrenia, epileptic attacks? In 20th century, they will compete over who finds a more original medical explanation of my state of mind. However, William James, in The Varieties of Religious Experience, never fails to astound us with his austere sobriety when he writes, I quote, "Medical materialism seems indeed a good appellation for the too simple-minded system of thought which we are considering. Medical materialism finishes up St. Paul by calling his visions on the road to Damascus a discharging lesion of the occipital cortex, he being an epileptic. It snuffs out St. Teresa as a hysteric, St. Francis of Assisi as an hereditary degenerate." James further criticizes the approach of medical materialism by stating that there simply exist moments of sentimental and mystical experience that carry an enormous sense of inner authority and illumination with them when they come. But they come seldom, and they do not come to everyone, and the rest of life makes either no connection with them or tends to contradict them more than it confirms them. Therefore, does it even matter if my profound religious experience is corroborated by physical ailments? A migraine may come to some, but does everyone ascribe it the touch of celestial powers, a voice coming from God? Do I find my visions beautiful? Are they some spawn of wonderfully degenerated inner life? I believe they come from an entity to which I often refer to as a living light. In my allegorical letter to the Bishop of Constance, oh yes, even he has to turn to me in his hour of dire need. I quote, "The living light that reveals miracles speaks. In your official position, you are a father and pastor for the guidance of souls. Stretch out your hands to prevent a hostile man from sowing your field with tares. Watch over your garden, therefore, which the divine gift hath planted, and take care that its aromatic plants do not dry up." End quote. This is the light of the mind, as another strong, independent woman centuries later would observe. It is the most intangible entity of the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit, that dwells in the beautiful world of animals, gems, stones, plants, and other natural phenomena that I admire so much and describe with such love, such relish. My vision of the Holy Trinity is unique because of its poetic gusto and undeniable delight in putting into words ideas that otherwise persistently evade human tongue. I quote, "And just as there are three powers in the glowing heat of a flame, so the one God is in three persons." How is this? The flame consists of splendid brightness, purple vigor, and fiery glow. It has a splendid brightness so that it can shine its light, a purple vigor so that it can maintain its existence, and a fiery glow so that it can burn. Consider the Father in the splendid brightness, for he sends out his brightness to the faithful through the goodness of his fatherhood. And in the purple vigor held within the flame and containing its strength, consider the Son, who assumed a body from the Virgin, in which the Godhead declared it marvels. And in the fiery glow perceive the Holy Spirit, who pours his fire over the mind of believer. End quote. William James introduces us to so-called fraughtisms, to use the term of the psychologists. They consist of sensory automatism, hallucinations even. It is the manner in which modern people, scientists especially, ponder upon the light that I see shining so brightly in every element of reality, in animals, in people, in pebbles on the ground, in the clouds on the sky. The beauty of the Holy Spirit for me is concealed in every single being, living or unliving. It is the greenness of the grass in the spring. It is the glittering surface of an icy lake in the winter. It is hidden in the wrinkles of the face in the infirmary. It is hidden in the terrible suffering which I undergo repeatedly. I lie in my modest bed and suffer a pain that is in no way romantic. There is nothing noble about it. I would prefer if it was not there. However, I can feel the presence of the Holy Spirit who walks with me every bitter step of the way. I believe. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this lovely and also literary, with literature inspired, with a literary approach inspired interpretation of Hildegard. So I invite Dr. Diane Gruber from the Arizona State University, or more exactly from Barrett, the Honors College within the Arizona State University, to present her paper.
Thank you. And the piece is entitled "Reinterpreting the Past to Open the Future: the radical imaginative potential of Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. I begin with my deepest thanks to our organizers and institutional hosts, and especially my dear friends Andre and Alenka, for creating this opportunity to gather in a beautiful country, in a beautiful city, and in the somber and inspiring space that is the Salica Hostel, a site that stands as a symbol for so much of what we have gathered this week in the hopes of achieving: the transformation of sites of almost unimaginable human suffering into spaces of human gathering, conversation, friendship, and solidarity, from, as Janko said, from repression to expression. I will also express my gratitude to my former students who are accompanying us and from whom I continue to learn so much, and from whom I take much hope for the future, even in the face of what it is we must find a way to address. I have, since we began gathering to read and discuss Utopia over the last several months, been thinking much of Norman Garris's 10 Theses for a Minimum Utopia, and wondering if we might extend those ideas to something like mini-utopias, or perhaps micro-utopias, small, intimate, short occasions where better ways of dwelling are glimpsed and serve as reminders that what we are seeking is in fact possible. My final thanks are to all of you for creating this week one such micro-utopia. My contribution to our symposium's conversation is a modest one: to cull and condense what I take to be the most provocative theses relevant to our discussion of the utopic, gathered from anthropologist and political theorist and activist David Graeber's and archaeologist David Wengrow's 2021 700-page tome, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. So that was a rather ambitious thing to try to do in 10 minutes, but we'll see how that sort of goes. And the other thing I'd like to do after spending some time with Graeber and Wengrow's work together, there's a final concept that comes out of Graeber's solo work, a 2007 article entitled There Never Was a West, in which he interrogates the notion of the Western tradition. There's a concept I'd like to bring from that as well into our conversation. So I begin with a passage from The Dawn of Everything. This is Graeber and Wengrow writing. What if we treat people from the beginning as imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures who deserve to be understood as such? What if, instead of telling a story about how our species fell from some idyllic state of equality, we ask how we came to be trapped in such tight conceptual shackles that we can no longer even imagine the possibility of reinventing ourselves? As we have discussed throughout this gathering, the possibility of anything better than our current situation is dependent upon the capacity for robust imagination. While when we envision the utopic, we often fruitfully develop visions looking toward the space of the future, the Dawn of Everything shifts our focus behind us to the cultivation of a complex understanding of our dynamic human history, the better to design our future. Allow me then to offer, much too quickly, several of Graeber and Wengrow's provocations, which may prove useful in our continuing attempt to loosen, or at least shake loudly, the intellectual shackles of which they speak. The Dawn of Everything is a compendium of recent worldwide archaeological findings and interpretations, findings that might be forcing a near total reconceptualization of our understanding of human history. The grand conceptual narratives under which we have and continue to operate in conscious and not so conscious manners are beginning to shudder and shatter. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Poverty Point in the United States, Teotihuacan in Mexico, Tel Sabe Abyad in Syria, Talyanki in Ukraine, to name but a few of the many examples provided by Graeber and Wengrow, are all archaeological sites that initially proved difficult to interpret because they could not be forced into the conventional and accepted governing historical narratives. To wit, that human social organization everywhere and always followed a set path from hunter-gatherers to agriculture to the early settlements that would become the towns, then cities that became the sites simultaneously of specialized human knowledge and inevitable hierarchies, be they priestly or aristocratic. Similarly, that such social patterns demonstrate further something fundamental about what it means to be human, either to have been a happy but simple-minded variation of Rousseau's natural man in the state of nature before the fall from innocence into the social world, or, and relatedly, to have been the Hobbesian, violent, pre-social contract man, solitary, poor, nasty, until such time as the Leviathan of any sort could be put in place to keep us from a state of permanent warfare to which we are supposedly naturally inclined. To continue in these long-held narratives, that there was something inevitable about the course of economic development, and even the use of the term development here is telling, whether you take that to be Adam Smith's hunters, then shepherds, then agriculture, then commerce stages, or Marx and Engels' primitive communism, then feudalism, then mercantilism, etc. And that given what one takes human beings by nature to be, that the forms of economic activity are pretty simple to recognize, categorize, and understand as they seemingly occur in every human culture. Similarly to the economic development, that concerning forms of governance, that again, given who one takes human beings to be, that all societies tend towards recognizable forms and exercises of power and forms of governance, whether those be nobility, aristocracy, kingships, priest classes, etc. Of such narratives, Graeber and Wengrow write, first, they simply aren't true. Next, they make the past needlessly dull. And most importantly for our symposium, that they have dire political implications in terms of what we believe to be possible or even plausible for human beings. In contrast to the standard vision of the drab, seemingly preordained, plodding human march, which, it should be noted in these narratives, is nonetheless always a march forward and upward, Graeber and Wengrow write, it's becoming increasingly clear that the earliest known evidence of human social life resembles rather a carnival parade of political forms, far more than it does the drab abstractions of evolutionary theory. Again, the widespread and common sense understanding of humanity and human history have been insufficient narratives for archaeologists to make interpretive sense of the findings of the various sites. These are sites that contain few of the markers of extreme social hierarchy that we have come to expect. Where are the palaces? Where are the aristocratic enclaves? Where are the ball fields? All right, finding in these cultures, not finding what we expect to find in terms of governance. That many of these sites demonstrate remarkable technological achievements without evidence of the extreme social stratification, for example, the use of slave labor, that we have come to believe are necessary for the building of huge monuments such as the pyramids. That these sites appear to have sometimes been occupied only occasionally, and may have served as large destination sites for the mingling of various societies, in which forms of religious interplay and commerce that are somewhat unrecognizable to us appear to have occurred. That many of these archaeological sites are beginning to demonstrate something that we might call play farming. Rather than the sort of standard narrative, we go from hunter-gatherers, and of course our fall begins with agriculture, and it's all sort of downhill from there. The large question that needs to be answered is, why does it take so many millennia for agriculture to even develop? Human beings know how to do it, why do they choose not to? And in many sites we see evidence, it appears, of people play farming, trying it on for a while and then deciding there's no way, right? That's what you are going to commit yourself to. Similarly, there is increasing evidence of play kings, temporary rulers, wartime rulers, rulers who are given symbolic power in the face of one's enemies or opponents, but who actually hold no real power inside those societies. And what we can assume to be more consensual and communal decision-making based cultures. The archaeological record is starting to demonstrate complex forms of good exchanges that little resemble our common contemporary conceptions of barter and trade. Evidence of Neolithic matriarchies that were dismissed out of hand in the mid-20th century are suddenly back again with evidence, increasing archaeological evidence of elaborate burial rituals that seem not to have been burial rituals of kings, as much as that seems to be the only interpretation we can put on them. Instead, they are elaborate burials of perhaps the people who were most disabled and marginalized inside certain cultures, who in some sort of Hobbesian notion you can expect to have been sort of left on the mountainside to perish, but instead seem to have been cared for in incredibly intimate ways inside the cultures. I'm just skimming the surface here. All right, I will leave the 700 pages of the book to you to discover example after example after example of things that archaeologically cannot be explained with the narratives we are most accustomed to. A small caveat here. Lest we go seeking in all of this for Engels' primitive communism in the hope of identifying that as our natural state, and the one to which we might most rightly return, Graeber and Wengrow complicate any such efforts by spending much time with the anthropological concept of schismogenesis. That is, the idea that from this carnival parade of forms, there emerges evidence that rather than all human societies following similar trajectories, with the only difference perhaps being the speed at which they are traveling or the point they have reached in the path, instead, many cultures demonstrate what should be unremarkable but seems not to be, which is simply the idea that any group of people living in close proximity to one another look at the other society's social organization and say, no, thank you. Right? That you're not sort of forced into social organization by some historical force, that human beings look at other cultures and decide, in the classic example they use in the book, in the Northwest United States, what you have are extremely hierarchical, material-rich native cultures. And then just several hundred miles south of that in Northern California, you have native cultures that seem to have looked northward and said, they're sort of like, I don't know, 4th century Puritans or something. We don't want all of the elaborate goods. We refuse to have slaves. We're going to organize our society in a very different way. And I find much hope even now in this notion of schismogenesis, that one group of people looks at another group of people and has the wherewithal and the ability to say that we're going to consciously choose to do something different. Now, clearly the question we must next answer is if such forms of radically different choice of social organization are still a possibility in the contemporary world. And because I'm feeling optimistic today, surrounded by such hope and vitality, I will say yes, and agree with Graeber and Wengrow when they write, is not the capacity to experiment with different forms of social organization itself the quintessential part of what makes us human? Finally, in the service of the project of continuing to experiment and hope for different forms of social organization, I will conclude with another of Graeber's earlier political concepts, that of the ugly mirror. Graeber situates its origin in the circus and gladiatorial games of the Roman amphitheater and defines it as a means of social control wherein the people are regularly exposed to a vision of what the world would become were they allowed to run things on their own. He writes, where the procedures of the Athenian agora were designed to maximize the dignity of the demos and the thoughtfulness of its deliberations, the Roman circus was almost exactly the opposite. It had more the air of regular state-sponsored lynchings, almost every quality normally ascribed to the mob by later writers hostile to democracy, the capriciousness, overt cruelty, factionalism, hero worship, mad passions, all were not only tolerated, but actually encouraged. It was as if an authoritarian elite were trying to provide the public with a constant nightmare image of the chaos that would ensue if they were to take power into their own hands. I will close by asking us to keep our eyes on the vision of Graeber and Wengrow's historical carnival parade rather than the Roman gladiatorial circus, whose contemporary manifestation may be our own reluctance to and fear of envisioning more creative, more humane, more challenging ways of organizing and caring for ourselves and one another because of an instilled fear that we may not be up to the task, and it would be better to accept our current conditions than to go seeking something better. In keeping the panorama of the sheer and thrilling diversity of past human social organizing before us, in effect, in placing one tentative foot into the past, we might be stepping into a more, not less, human comportment and way of being. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, which sort of returns us back to the question of history and how we, not only how we look into it, but also how we narrate it, and that there is always the possibility to look at things differently, or from this different, not perspective, but from a different, let's say from a different stance.
Stand would be good.
Stand? Yeah.
Yes.
So, now I'd like to invite Dr. Eric Ramsey, also from Barrett, the Honors College, which is a part of Arizona State University, to deliver his paper.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been asked by the organizers to just say a few words this evening before we take a coffee break and then return to discuss the entire week that we spent together. When I helped open the meeting at the beginning, we shared our gratitude to all of those who made the work that we are about to undertake possible, who created space and room for us to do this and here at something like the end, or at least the last talk. I want to say thank you to all of those who presented and did all of the really difficult work that it takes to be together, to keep questioning and keep responding to one another. Maybe just in a word, all the work it takes to talk this way, so, with enthusiasm. All right. Beauty is not finished, and neither are we. The work of art is precisely not the product that is finished when the artist's work on it is done, says Gadamer, as my epigraph. We sense it in our experience across all the arts. Beauty says to us, we are not finished, and as long as we exist, we cannot be so. We are incomplete and incompletable. This seemingly harsh address issued from our finitude is, to the contrary, a gift, one that ever opens the future. Art and its address could not get to us were we complete or finished, other than perhaps as mere decoration. Our being open to the world, that is, being ecstatic, is the by the way of which and for the sake of which we attend to art and beauty. If our openness is narrowed by living in mere calculation, then only a few slim paths offer themselves to our ways of understanding. Insofar as we are narrowed, so much will be missed. So little of what we might welcome were things otherwise with us will not make their way to us, will have no way of transforming and be the consequence of the transformation of our self-understanding. Is it not here in this sorry state that beauty and art might become a surprise initiator of change? Is it not here that we ask the most of beauty's power? Beauty can set into relief our ways of having to be, that is to say, our having to be hermeneutic beings, which is to say further and more precisely, instinct will not be enough. Set into relief thus, we shall come to understand some careful artifice is part of the demand made on the human condition. Heidegger says in one of his lectures on the poet Hölderlin, beauty is the poetic name of being. The splendor of beauty, a splendor echoing still from its ancient Greek understanding, is with us if we are but able to yield and to attend to it. The splendor of beauty is always trying to shine through. What then keeps the majority of the world so lacking in splendor? To say it otherwise, what blocks beauty's constant attempt at arrival? If beauty is always on its way and underway, what then stands in its way such that its arrival stays away? As the psychoanalyst James Hillman puts it in his essay on beauty, we must, it seems, invite the return of beauty because we have repressed it, because it seems its power frightens us. Perhaps this is why kitsch is everywhere and so popular as a substitute for art, because it pretends to be beauty, but has none of art's disrupting, you must change your life power. The easy and comfortable quickness of taking kitsch in makes us less ready for an engagement with eminent art. Learning the ways of common denotation alone from which kitsch takes its cues and often handsomely remunerates them, it is easy when compared to the risky and seldom rewarded acts of creative connotation. Remember, kitsch not only plays directly to our prejudices, it more often than not flatters them as well. This makes it difficult to turn down the offer and to avoid the seduction. Beauty, to the contrary, should call us out of the stronghold we have unfortunately made of our openness and into the vulnerable wilderness of our being together. Beauty, somehow and all at once, presupposes understanding, points us toward the task of understanding, and upends aspects of what we think we already understand all too well. Beauty's power is to be able to make us think differently about things we have come to believe could not be thought of otherwise. And this includes what we think of ourselves and what we think we are capable of when acting in concert with one another. In a solidarity responsible to both ourselves and to each other, we shall need to attend to art with care, to open ourselves to its address, and a way fitting to Gadamer's lovely saying, quote, "We cannot understand without wanting to understand. That is, without wanting to let something be said," end quote. Insofar as beauty announces in its ever-contemporaneousness that things are able to be otherwise in the future, it has a relation to the future and consequently a sense of utopia and a sense of hope, and let's say the best sense of both of these words. Let's end then by being committed to the coming to our senses, all of them, but in a manner that has few, if any, of the illusions, because, as we all well understand, what holds out hope has danger in its other hand. In solidarity, in conversation, and why not just say it, in love, we shall attempt to be on guard with respect to the dangers and welcoming with respect to the offers of hope. Thank you. Thank you. I wrote that over 6 weeks ago, and I'm so hopeful it sounded like I wrote it last night. So much of what we've done together seems to keep talking to one another. And so, shall I take us to the coffee? Yeah. So after the coffee break, we hopefully will come back, and we have about 10 questions, but we will turn to you first. What questions do you hope we take away? What other kind of comments would you like to make? So thank you all. We'll see you in 15 minutes.